I've had this disc-built sander for a number of years. There's no telling how many thousand miles this thing has gone, but it's had an intermittent noise, and I've tried to locate it before, but now the intermittent has become more continuous. There's the noise. Almost sounds like a bushing trying to gall, but there are no bushings on this, and there's no grease zerks to grease any bearings. So at this point in time, we're going to take it apart and keep taking things apart until we find a bad bearing. It was a two-man job and took about 2 hours to get the disc off of the main shaft before we could completely disassemble this sander. Sometimes simple things just aren't simple. The hardest part of this repair was removing this disc from the main shaft. Once we were able to finally get this apart, we could see that they had somehow burred or mushroomed the end of this shaft and then driven it all together at the factory. Used a file to dust that off, get rid of that distortion. Now that shaft goes in and out of there quite freely. What made it so difficult to get this off of here was this piece of sheet metal wrapped around this disc. And you couldn't get in here with a puller or even make a puller to help push that shaft out of this disc. And you can't remove the sheet metal because it's bolted on behind the disc. Once the disc was off of there, we were able to disassemble the rest of the sander. The main shaft bearing was locked up, would not turn by hand. And of the other 3 bearings, 2 of those were bad. So we went ahead and replaced all 4 bearings. 4 bearings, 3 of them are bad. That one's locked up solid. Put new bearings in the end roller. A word of caution if you're working on a piece of this equipment, they did not deburr anything on this sander. These edges were razor sharp. The same way on the main drive roller, these edges were sharp. The main drive roller locks onto this shaft in 4 places. These edges were sharp, and the edges of this keyway were razor sharp. Go ahead and take the time and deburr these. You'll prevent the loss of your blood, and it'll make it a lot easier to work on this again sometime in the future. After replacing the bearings, putting on a new belt and new sandpaper, this should work like a new machine. Certainly no more grease left in there. I'll wash that out and see what it looks like. I like to do an autopsy on some of this stuff and see why it failed. The dust cover on this wasn't that effective in blocking out that fine sanding dust. It got in there and mixed with the grease. Every once in a while a chunk of that stuff would get in there and bind up and the bearing would start making noise. The reason this bearing was locked up was probably because we were beating on that shaft and that, trying to get the disc off of the shaft. Jarred some of that loose and it bound up in here tight. Surprisingly, after I washed that out, it turns quite freely. It does have a rough spot on it, so it needed to be replaced. This is the bearing from the opposite end of the main shaft. The grease in it was clean. The grease was getting dry. It was time to replace that bearing. But of the 4 bearings, this is the best one.